They came for her at dawn, not with swords raised or banners unfurled, but with the silence of men who had done this many times before. The city of Acre still slept beneath the smoldering ruins of the Crusader kingdom, its churches torn open like carcasses, its icons shattered, its priests missing. In the calm before sunrise, when the streets were cold and the wind carried the smell of salt, two Mamluk riders stood before the door of a modest Christian home. They knocked only once. History does not remember her name. They never bothered to record the names. Her husband was already dead, executed at the city walls with the knights who refused to kneel. She didn't see that. She only saw the two men in scaled leather armor, their faces veiled, their eyes indifferent. One spoke in Arabic, the other in the hard Turkic dialect of the steppe, but she recognized neither. The words didn't matter. Their hands did. They entered without permission. She was taken, not as a prisoner of war, but as an asset, a living currency that would be spent in the markets of Cairo or Damascus. There was no trial, no negotiation, no priest's final blessing. She was captured as a matter of routine, the same way a farmer collects wheat. Efficient, rehearsed, inevitable. As they led her through the city, she passed homes with doors kicked open, furniture smashed, and small objects, crosses, prayer beads, children's toys, scattered on the ground. Each one was a quiet monument to the same ritual of conquest. The Mamluks were not driven by lust or chaos. Their brutality was colder than both. It was institutional. To understand the horror of what was done to Christian women, you must first understand this fundamental truth. The Mamluks themselves were born from violence. They were taken as children, carved into soldiers, stripped of identity, and told that mercy was weakness. As boys, they were whipped, starved, made to kneel. As men, they learned to make others kneel. The woman walked barefoot toward the waiting ship. She would never again see her homeland. Her life, her faith, her name, her body was about to pass into the hands of an empire built not by kings, but by slaves who had learned to rule. Before we descend into the chambers where Christian women were broken, we must first understand the men who held the keys. The Mamluk was not born, he was manufactured. In the markets of Circassia, the Pontic steppe, the Balkans, and the Caucasus, slave merchants moved in caravans like vultures across snow-beaten plains. They purchased boys who barely reached adolescence, 12, sometimes 14. Their families were gone, or threatened, or deceived with promises of Islamic schooling and a better life. Many of these children came from Christian homes, Orthodox, Catholic, Armenian. They would never see those homes again. They were shipped to Egypt, a land not yet theirs, and placed within the colossal training castles built by previous dynasties. The citadel of Cairo, the barracks of the citadel of Damascus, fortresses where steel sang and sleep was rationed like food. The boys were converted to Islam by force or persuasion. The distinction didn't matter. Their identities were erased, their mother tongues forbidden. They learned the Arabic of commands, not of love. Their bodies were reshaped. They were starved, then fed, whipped, then rewarded. They were molded like metal, hammered until they no longer bent. The Mamluks learned the bow, the lance, the curved blade. They learned how to ride horses not as mounts, but as extensions of their own will. In time, they began to see themselves not as slaves, but as chosen instruments of fate. Their scars became proof of a worth. It was genius in its cruelty, an army of kidnapped boys, trained in a foreign land, loyal to no bloodline except the brotherhood. They formed a caste of warriors faster than knights, deadlier than infantry, and harder than mercenaries. Their training was so brutal, so unrelenting, that death was not considered a risk. It was considered a filter. Weakness was burned out like impurity from gold. And when these boys became men, when they held power, when they rode beneath banners that once terrified them as children, they carried with them a single lesson imprinted deeper than any scripture. He who is broken has the right to break. So when the Mamluks came to Constantinople, to Syria, to the Crusader cities, and later to the Christian villages of Armenia and Albania, they did not take women as invaders. They took them as men, reclaiming what had been stolen from them. When a Mamluk army conquered a city, the world beneath its walls changed instantly. It was not the chaotic frenzy of Mongol storms, nor the ceremonial conquest of Roman legions. It was something colder, almost bureaucratic. A process designed to absorb human lives into a system, not annihilate them. Churches were sealed. Priests were executed or locked away. Men of fighting age were either killed or enslaved as manual labor. And the women were separated. What happened next was not an accident of war. It was policy. Women of noble families were taken as diplomatic assets. Their bodies became bargaining chips. A lord's daughter could be bartered to secure a treaty with a vassal emirate or a rival aristocracy. Their beauty was a currency more valuable than gold, because gold could not produce heirs. A Christian woman with noble blood could be converted, married to a Mamluk officer, and give birth to a child who would inherit land, wealth, and legitimacy. The empire knew the mathematics of the womb. Common women were not so fortunate. Some were sold into slave markets that stretched from Alexandria to Damascus, their prices determined like livestock. A woman of strong build was valued for labor. A pale foreign complexion was exotic. It fetched a higher price. A virgin was a luxury product, purchased by governors, merchants, or soldiers who wanted to prove dominance over defeated faiths. But there was a third category, the one that history prefers not to name: the gifts. These were handed to commanders as rewards, not purchased, not negotiated, taken. A soldier who distinguished himself in battle was not given a medal, he was given flesh. A young Christian widow brought to his tent, trembling, with no idea whether she would be a temporary indulgence or the mother of his eventual heirs. The soldier could choose. Her future was his appetite. The hypocrisy of the Mamluk order reveals itself here. These were men raised in chains, men who had tasted ownership on their own skin. Yet they mastered the art of turning others into property. Their cruelty was not impulsive. It was ritual. Their pleasure was not lust. It was control, a mirror image of the humiliation they once endured. For many Christian women, the worst moment was not what was done to them. It was how quietly it was done. There is a moment that every captive remembers, a moment more terrifying than the cell, the whip, or the first night in a stranger's bed. It is the moment when the conqueror tries to change your name, because that is the moment he tries to change your soul. For Christian women taken by the Mamluks, the conversion was not always violent. Violence was easy. Violence was familiar. Breaking faith was another art entirely. The process was done with ceremony, with patience, even with tenderness. And that tenderness was the blade. They were brought before a judge or a military cleric and asked to repeat a phrase they did not understand. Their heads were covered, their eyes lowered. Sometimes translators were present, sometimes not. They stood before men in embroidered robes who spoke to them as if they were already dead. Their old names were Christian names: Anna, Helena, Theodora, Maria. And these names were forbidden. They were given new ones: Fatima, Aisha, Samira. Names that were not chosen, but imposed. The ritual was not merely religious. It was psychological warfare crafted over generations. A woman forced to say, "There is no God but God," was not just declaring faith. She was declaring defeat. Every word was a nail sealing her former life shut. There was no priest to defend her, no husband to intervene, no community to reclaim her honor. The Mamluks understood that if you want to break a people, you suffocate their myths. You make their saints irrelevant, their gods unreachable. And the women who resisted, the ones who spat, screamed, prayed, they were taken to the walls of the barracks and shown something worse than death: the fate of those who refused. A woman who denied conversion did not die quickly. Death was granted to warriors, not captives. She was given to the soldiers in rotation, one night at a time, a reminder to every other woman that the gods of her childhood could not save her. But the cruelest cases were the ones who submitted quietly, the ones who whispered the Arabic words without tears. The clerics praised them, called them reborn, and smiled. Their chains became silk, their cages became matrimonial chambers. They were told they were now wives or concubines. They were given perfume, clothing, and promises. Their captors congratulated themselves on their mercy, never realizing, or perhaps knowing all too well, that the woman was not alive. She was preserved to carry the bloodline of her conqueror. Cairo was not merely a capital, it was a labyrinth. A city built on power and paranoia, hardened by smoke and sand, ringed with walls that listened. Its skyline was a mosaic of minarets and fortress towers. But the true empire did not live in the sunlight. It lived behind carved wooden screens, behind curtains of silk, in the corridors where no man except the master dared to walk. Within these hidden interiors were the harems of the Mamluk elite. Western minds love to imagine harems as orgies, a decadent playground of cushions, grapes, and sensuality. That myth is a coward's illusion. In the world of the Mamluks, the harem was not a place of pleasure. It was a vault, a breeding chamber, a political laboratory. The women inside were instruments, not companions. Their silence was the mortar that held dynasties together. Christian captives were prized in these chambers, not because they were loved, but because they were foreign. A Christian woman, once converted, erased the bloodline of an enemy and replaced it with the blood of a Mamluk. It was a conquest ritual that produced living trophies, children who bridged two worlds but belonged to only one. The halls were watched by eunuchs, men mutilated in childhood to ensure their loyalty. They were neither holy men nor holy servants, but something in between. They learned to move softly, without making sound. They learned to listen to breathing patterns, to detect tears through walls, to intervene in the slightest whisper of defiance. Their lives were devoted to guarding women they would never touch, never love, never truly see. Inside, the women themselves formed silent hierarchies. The senior concubine controlled access to the master. The favored wife controlled food, clothing, and sleep. The newly captured Christian girl, pale, trembling, eyes searching for heaven, was always at the bottom. She was given a room no larger than a stable stall. Candles were rationed. Windows were narrow slits that let in just enough moonlight to remind her that night still existed. Some women adapted. They learned the language, the gestures, the etiquette of survival. They learned to bow at the right angle, to keep their voices no louder than pouring water. They became ghosts who breathed. Others broke, and those who broke did not scream. In a palace of silence, screams were the one thing forbidden. They drew attention. They reminded the rulers that the walls still remembered. The Mamluks understood something that most conquerors only stumbled upon. A woman's body could be used to rewrite history. In the dim rooms of their palaces, beneath carved ceilings and latticed walls, Christian women were turned into vessels of legitimacy. Not wives, not lovers, not even concubines. They were wombs, breathing containers for the future. A son born from a Christian captive was not an accident. He was a weapon. The Mamluks were a dynasty of soldiers with no noble blood, no ancestral claim to the throne, no lineage that stretched back to kings or prophets. Their power came from the sword, and they needed something stronger. They needed sons who could inherit their empire without being challenged as outsiders. A Christian woman, once converted, gave them something priceless, a child that no rival could deny. He was born in Cairo, raised in Islam, trained in the barracks, baptized in discipline. His mother's past was sealed away. Her body became the bridge between two civilizations. And then the bridge was forgotten. But the system had a flaw. It depended on breaking women without shattering them. If a woman resisted too much, she died, and her captor lost an asset. Too little, and she might prefer death. Or worse, poison. The Mamluks learned to manipulate the female spirit the way they manipulated steel. They used fear, then kindness, then isolation. They controlled light, sound, food, pregnancy. They decided when a woman would enter the baths, when she would speak to others, when she would be touched, when she would be seen. And when she conceived, the game changed. Pregnancy elevated her, but only as long as her body held the future. Servants carried her meals. Older wives stopped spitting insults. Even the eunuchs softened their eyes. The Sultan or Emir would visit her more often, not out of love, but out of calculation. A son meant stability. A daughter meant another tradable object. If she gave birth to a son, she became valuable, almost sacred. But make no mistake, she was not free. She was a cage for the next ruler. And once the child grew, her influence sank like a stone in the Nile. Some mothers died quietly. Others were retired to separate quarters. Others, those who became inconvenient, simply disappeared. The most chilling part? The Mamluks did not call this cruelty. They called it governance. Not every Christian woman taken by the Mamluks was destined for the silence of the harem. Some were used in a different theater, a stage of humiliation designed for men. When a nobleman, knight, or Crusader commander resisted, the Mamluks did not always execute him. Execution was too merciful, too swift, too clean. Instead, they made him watch. They paraded the women of his household before him, his wife, his daughter, his sister, bound, stripped of their crosses, their hair cut short like prisoners. The men who once prayed for God's mercy were made to kneel in front of them. To force a man to lose a battle is one thing. To show him that he cannot protect his women, that was annihilation. The Mamluks had learned this tactic from centuries of their own torment. When they were slaves, their captors had taught them that a man's identity was not in his sword, but in the safety of those who depended on him. Break that, and he becomes a shadow. So when the roles reversed and the slave became master, they perfected the art. There are chronicles, Armenian, Greek, Latin, which whisper about the rituals. A general's wife presented at a banquet as a gift. A captured Christian noble forced to pour wine for his captor, while his daughters were examined like horses at auction. A priest made to watch his sister carried away to be converted, his prayers drowned under the laughter of soldiers. Sometimes, the humiliation was theatrical. A woman was forced to walk through the streets dressed in silk that barely covered her body, jewels around her neck, escorted by guards who announced her as a gift of war. She was not raped in secret. She was elevated, paraded, publicly claimed. The message was clear. The empire owns her more proudly than her faith ever did. But there was another layer to this cruelty, more subtle and far more devastating. The Mamluks rarely used the women immediately. They waited. They kept them untouched for days, sometimes weeks, while their husbands or fathers rotted in cells just a few meters away. That waiting was the torture. The men prayed for miracles. The women prayed for death. And when the moment finally came, both prayers went unanswered. In the end, there was no scream, no bloodied battlefield, no heroic last stand. There was only a door closing, and a man realizing that the war had followed him home. For many Christian women taken by the Mamluks, the most terrifying part was not the initial violence. It was the quiet after. The world outside their bodies still existed, but the world inside them was rewritten. No chains around their wrists, no guards at their doors. Just a life that no longer belonged to them. Some were given apartments within palaces or noble homes. They were clothed in fine silk, draped in perfumes, fed fruits and honey. They were told to pray like Muslims, speak like Arabs, walk like wives. From the outside, it looked like elevation, an escape from poverty into luxury. But luxury is the most silent prison ever invented. A woman who is beaten will scream. A woman who is surrounded by gold learns to whisper. The Mamluks understood that broken bones heal. Broken identities do not. So the conversion, the renaming, the ritual humiliation, these were merely the surface of the machine. The real cruelty lived in the architecture of everyday life. The women were moved away from their own language, away from other Christians, away from anyone who could remind them of what they once were. The Mamluks didn't just strip faith from them. They stripped memory. A woman might wake one morning in a courtyard of fountains, with sunlight dancing on marble tiles, hearing the call to prayer echo over the walls. She would see children playing, some hers, some not. She might even smile. And then she would remember that every one of those children belonged to the men who stole her, that she had no right to leave, to return home, to speak the name given to her at birth. Her body might be free from shackles, but her history was caged. Those who tried to run were punished with precision, not haste, not rage. Punishment was designed to echo. A woman caught escaping was not killed. She was brought back. She was displayed. And then she was handed to men who were not noble, not commanders, not princes, just soldiers, stable boys, gatekeepers. The empire trampled her through its lowest ranks so that everyone understood the hierarchy. Those who serve the state may taste its spoils. And after the shame had been burned into her skin and spirit, she was returned to her chambers, given fresh clothes, a bath, a new veil, perhaps jewelry. The Mamluks believed in resets, not forgiveness, not mercy. Just the certainty that a woman broken twice would never rise a third time. Not every captive accepted the fate carved for her. Some women, driven by memory and rage, defied the empire in ways that history rarely admits. Their resistance was not loud, not cinematic. It was subtle, slow-burning, and terrifying. A kind of rebellion that seeped through silk and marble. The first act of defiance was refusal. Some refused to speak Arabic. They whispered prayers in Greek or Armenian at night, rocking themselves to sleep with fragments of hymns remembered from childhood. They carved crosses into wooden furniture with hairpins, scratched them into the underside of tables, whispered them to their unborn children. These women understood something profound. Even a memory can be a weapon. As long as they remembered Christ, or Mary, or the sound of bells ringing over a village at dawn, the empire had not fully taken them. Others fought with poison. The baths of the harems were filled with herbs and oils, gifts from merchants, remedies from healers, luxuries from across the Mediterranean. A woman could slip a leaf of aconite beneath her tongue, mix crushed nightshade into tea, or smear belladonna onto her lips before she kissed her master. Some Mamluk emirs died inexplicably in their sleep, physicians puzzled, astrologers confused. In the chronicles, these deaths were blamed on spirits, on curses, on bad stars. But the women whispered among themselves. They knew. Let an empire train an army of child slaves and eunuchs. A single girl with access to the kitchens was far more dangerous. And some resisted through motherhood. They bore sons, raised them in silence, and whispered forbidden truths when the guards were gone. Your father is a tyrant. Your blood comes from Christians. You do not belong to the sword. Some boys believed them. Most did not. But a few grew up confused, not quite Mamluk, not quite Christian. Disobedient commanders, faithless officers, unstable heirs. Doubt was a poison of its own. Then there were the ones who chose a final rebellion, death. Some slit their wrists in the baths, the water turning red like crushed pomegranates. Others threw themselves from balconies, silk robes fluttering like broken wings. A few strangled themselves with their own veils. The palace always tried to hide these deaths, saying the woman fell ill or was weak or could not bear childbirth. The lie mattered less than the silence that followed. A corpse does not speak, a rumor does. But the empire remembered. Every woman who resisted became a ghost in the corridors. Eunuchs walked faster past certain rooms. Commanders locked their doors at night. The Mamluks, born from slavery themselves, had learned one truth. A body may be owned, but a soul, if it ever chooses to burn, cannot be contained. History, like empire, is selective. It remembers conquerors and forgets the conquered. It writes the names of sultans in gold ink and leaves the screams of their victims buried in dust. The Mamluks knew this better than most. They built their palaces from stolen children, forged their armies from broken boys, and carved their dynasties into the bones of conquered lands. But in the silence behind the banners and marble mosques, in the shadows beneath their military triumphs, one truth survived. They were terrified of the people they crushed. Documents tell us how the Mamluks won battles, how they defeated Crusaders, how they repelled Mongols. But the stories of the women they subjugated were hidden, not because they lacked consequence, but because they held too much. They revealed the empire's greatest flaw. Power born from trauma, sustained by repetition, always consumes itself. Some Christian women survived not by fleeing, but by living long enough to become invisible. They blended into the fabric of Egyptian society. Their children grew into generals and merchants. Their grandchildren became scholars and governors. They erased their past because remembering it was lethal. Their victories were quiet. Their vengeance was slow. Their blood seeped into the veins of the empire without permission. Others became legends, not heroes, not saints. Legends whispered across generations, half remembered, half feared. A nameless Armenian concubine who poisoned an emir and disappeared. A Greek noblewoman who slit the throat of the eunuch guarding her chamber. A Syrian girl who smothered her newborn son rather than let him become a soldier of the empire. These stories never made the chronicles, but they made nightmares. And the Mamluks, those masters of discipline and calculated brutality, learned to fear the very thing they thought they had mastered, the will of a captive. In the end, their downfall came not from the Crusader knights they had humiliated, nor the Mongols they had turned back at Ain Jalut. It came from within, from their own sons, their own vassals, their own commanders who forgot the hunger of slavery and embraced the arrogance of rulers. Corruption rotted their courts, and greed poisoned their unity. The system that had once been forged in fire collapsed under its own weight. The empire of slaves became the empire of spoiled princes. And the women? They did not rise in rebellion. They did not overthrow sultans. They simply outlived them. Their children buried the men who had imprisoned them. Their descendants walked freely in cities the Mamluks once ruled with an iron pulse. No banners, no fanfare, just quiet survival. That is the truth empires fear most. Not the enemy with a sword, the victim who refuses to die.